Kodak Educate. So this is a first of our Kodak Educate sessions. Natalie's going to just open with a bit of an acknowledgement of country, and then I'm going to run through the background of Kodak Educate and thank some of our supporters.
The traditional owners of the land upon which we stand, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And wherever you are in the world, we ask that you just take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which you stand. Welcome to Coda Zero.
So thanks, Nat. So we're really proud to collaborate with Philips, who are supporting this educational event. Philips aims to offer access to world-class healthcare education in order to enhance performance of healthcare professionals and improve patient outcomes. This premise is really, I guess, the core of the Educate pillar for CODA. We've carried the medium is the message concept forward from SMAC, and we're really wanting to facilitate open access to high quality education and also tackle topics that are really pertinent to our community and driven by community feedback. So without further ado, welcome to Coda Zero Educate session. Really excited to have you on board and hoping to go away with some really good prototypes for change.
And I think that's a really great segue, that interaction between the self and the wider world is a good segue to what Simon is going to talk about. Simon is a professor of emergency medicine in Manchester and leads the St Emmeline's blog and podcast. And Simon, we wanted to ask you a little bit about our relationship as individual practitioners with the body of medical evidence. People have said that COVID-19 has seen the death of evidence-based healthcare. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on that and what's rising in its place?
Yeah, sure. My mind's still spinning from the first two speakers, actually, because there's so much for me to sort of process in there. There's a lot of learning. Where I sit, it just makes me feel as if there's a hell of a lot more I need to learn about the world. And that's great. That's education, isn't it? It's learning new things and realizing that I've got a big parts of my life which I'm ignorant about. But I thought there was a couple of things in both of the first talks which I think really sort of ring true with me. And that's the idea that we can have all the technology in the world, we can have information, we can have ideas, but at the heart of everything that we do in medicine, there's us, and there's our beliefs, and there's how we work with evidence, and there's how we understand and process it. So we can have fantastic data, we can have fantastic information, but every single time that we meet a patient or we have an interaction or we decide to do something, then our personal values, our personal histories, and the way that we see the world changes that. And that came out in both talks. And I think that's really pertinent to where we are now with COVID-19 and evidence, which is where I'm going to talk for the next 20 minutes or so, if that's okay. Or I'll talk for about 5 minutes and then you can ask me a question. But this has been an amazing time in terms of what we know about COVID-19. If you take us back to January of this year, and I ask anybody, what did you know about COVID-19 back then? And the answer is nothing. And we've gone from zero, essentially, to where we are now in an incredibly short space of time. And I think that's been both an amazing opportunity, it's been really interesting, but it's also revealed some of the imperfections in how we deal with evidence and how we deal with belief. And I always like to talk about evidence-based medicine. As you know, we've talked about this for a long period of time through projects such as the Best Bets and the blog and things. But I think over the last 9 months, we've seen EBM stand for something slightly different, which is evidence, which at the beginning was lacking. And that's been replaced to a large extent, particularly in the early times, by belief and media. So the EBMs become evidence, belief, and media. And that balance between those three things has pulled backwards and forwards in a really interesting way. So if we whiz back to January again and think about how we liked our evidence to make our decisions, we wanted it to be really nice, built over long periods of time, progressive, wonderful. And then COVID-19 comes along and you say, right, I want it right now. And I just want it now. I'm not going to wait 12 to 17 years, which we know is how long it takes sometimes to have evidence to hit the bedside. I want it right now. And the analogy I drew with this is back before pre-COVID-19, our idea of evidence is we'd like it like a Michelin-starred restaurant. We'd want to know that it came from brilliant sources, it had great ingredients, it was produced by wonderful people with years of experience, and we could then consume it and think it was just wonderful. And then COVID-19 comes along, and it's like we've had 10 pints of lager, we've arrived at a dodgy burger van, and we're prepared to eat anything. We've got no idea what's in it. We don't know what the ingredients are. We're not sure who made it, and we're not entirely sure whether it's going to be any good for us. And that kind of move has happened really quickly, including across people who are very, very intelligent, like me, like you, like other people. And think what we did back at the beginning. We tried all sorts of drugs. We'd try anything that worked in a test tube. And some of those things we now know are probably harmful. And some of those things we know don't work. And some of them we now know do work. So things like dexamethasone. But it's been fascinating to just see how people's beliefs about how they make decisions and how they think they're rational and what evidence you need to shift you changes when we're under pressure. And particularly in medicine, where this idea that we can see a disease which is, absolutely horrific, affecting so many people, killing so many people. And the idea of us just standing back and doing nothing but supportive care it really pushes us. And that's made us make decisions and made us do things which pre-COVID we would have thought was completely irrational. And the other thing that I think, just before I go back to you guys, is just the speed. Charlie Reynard, one of my colleagues here in Manchester, showed, I think about a month ago, that at that time we were seeing 6,500 publications per week on COVID-19. And there's no way that anybody can keep up with that. But even if we filter it and use the blogs, use the podcasts, use people you trust to filter into the quality information, because there is some good stuff out there, even then the pace of change is huge. And my other sort of tagline, buzzword at the moment, is to take the evidence-based medicine approach, which is good, but it's old, it's traditional, it's slow, it's difficult. And we have to embrace what I call evidence-based agility. We need to have the ability to rapidly find the good quality stuff and find ways to translate that into practice and to teach it and to share it and to discuss it and to argue it and to see where its strengths are. And when we find out next week that what we thought last week was wrong, we've got to be agile and honest enough to say, I was wrong, and move on. And that's not been a theme of evidence-based medicine in the past. It's been very difficult. People get inertia. They like doing something, and once they like doing it, we really need to push them hard to stop them doing it when we know that it's not a good idea. So that's what I found absolutely fascinating during COVID-19. Terrible disease, but oh my gosh, it's shown us a lot about ourselves, a lot about how we make decisions.
Jesse, do you have questions from the audience for Simon?
Yeah, so Twitter's starting to light up, and there's a couple of questions. I guess one of the key things around this, if I can synthesize the questions and the comments, is how does this kind of evidence-based agility and having to, I guess, act with educated trial and error start to become meshed into a more formal clinical governance process? I guess because you acknowledge your first point was we're faulty humans bound to our own biases. So how are we ensuring that we're doing things that are just not just seeing the result that we want to see? How do we wrap a research framework around this?
I think that's incredibly hard, because you're right that we see the world through our own eyes, which are incredibly biased. I'm going to give a shout out to, not a shout out, but I'm going to draw comparisons between what happened in the UK and what happened around the rest of the world in terms of things like therapies for COVID-19. If you looked around the world in February, March, there were lots of examples coming out of China, coming out of the US, of people trialing different ideas, usually in small observational trials, and saying, well, I've used this drug, these people got better, it must be good. And there was an awful lot of different things going on. The UK took a very different approach. And basically, because we're a national health service and we do things en masse, which has its problems, but on this occasion was amazing. We basically said that you're going to have supportive care if you come into hospital for COVID-19, And the only way we're going to trial anything different, apart from generalized known supportive care, is if you're in a clinical trial. So there wasn't a personal choice about this. It wasn't up to the doctor about me seeing patients about whether I gave them hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir or dexamethasone or azithromycin or lopinavir, ritonavir or whatever. I could only prescribe those if the patient happened to be randomized to them as part of one of the clinical trials in the UK. And that system, and I'm quite happy to talk about the way that those trials work. But we've now recruited in one of the trials in the UK, the recovery trial, we've now recruited over 13,000 patients. And that trial started at the end of March. And that is unheralded. And that's never happened before in a randomized controlled trial of medication, to get that many patients through in such a small period of time and to come to some definitive conclusions about therapies. And I think we were in a lucky position because the individual patient bedside conversation or departmental conversation was taken away from us as clinicians to some extent. And we said, we just need the information. We're going to do this as a research project. We're going to do it as a national research project. Pretty much all NHS hospitals recruited to this. And we've ended up with the biggest trials in the world, giving the best answers. So yeah, maybe taking it away from the individual clinicians is a good idea, Jesse.
Absolutely. So I think one other question that's, I guess, brief and a bit loaded, but I might elaborate on it. The loaded question is, what's the responsibility of the medical journals to publish only quality stuff? I'd elaborate on that maybe with adding, how do we peer review this stuff?
Yeah, that's a really good question because we've talked about this before, Jesse. I have very interesting views on peer review. We know it's a flawed process, and in COVID-19 we've seen that as well, haven't we? We saw the Surgisphere papers published in big journals, which then had to be withdrawn very rapidly afterwards because people couldn't get access to the data. And certainly at the beginning, there was an enthusiasm amongst the journals, and I'm an associate editor on a EMJ and an emergency medicine journal. There was an enthusiasm to just get stuff out. People want to be first, and journals are journalistic. You know, being first with your story and getting the scoop is just as applicable to the Sydney Times or Sydney Herald, sorry, as it is to the London Times. You know, we want to be there and we want to be first. And I think at the beginning, the standard for what we published definitely dropped in all journals. So you were getting trials of small numbers of patients, which were observational in leading international journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, the Lancet, the BMJ. And I kind of understand that because people were desperate to get that information out there and to learn more about what was going on. But what I didn't see, and what I think we should have had much more strongly put forward, was just how weak the evidence was at that time. And I'm not sure that we as not just the journals, but we as a community were quite as skeptical as we should have been when we were dealing with those smaller trials. And we still have to carry the caveat that for most therapies and in most therapies in the treatment of COVID-19, we don't yet have the data. And therefore, what we should be doing is working in a system where every patient who turns up with COVID-19 has the opportunity, and it's an opportunity for them and us, to be part of a clinical trial. That's what happens in oncology. Why the hell can't we do that in medicine?
So that seems like a good point, talking about data, to bounce back to Martin. In these platform trials that Simon's talking about, do you think that there'd be possibilities for the same sort of biases as you've talked about in the AI framework of singling out those more disadvantaged populations who've got higher mortality and morbidity, and then attributing that incorrectly and thus reinforcing those biases?
Yeah, it's a great point. I'd actually love to ask Simon about his thoughts on adaptive trials. I know this had been a sort of a hot topic even before COVID, but there's been a lot of push, during COVID, when there is a time pressure to get to an answer around whether we should sort of move to adaptive trial designs. But with that comes, the potential for, any time we deviate from the, canonical, true randomized clinical trial, like, we are potentially introducing biases. Would love to hear Simon's thoughts on that trade-off. There are some statistical tricks that we can do to try and optimize the design of adaptive trials, but like, in your opinion, on the ground, is this the future of how we should run clinical trials, or will we be doing traditional RCTs for the foreseeable?
I think we'll be doing both. I think the pandemic is the classic example where something like a platform adaptive trial works really, really well. So just to explain those two things very briefly, the platform is essentially the system of the trial which runs over a long period of time. So we define a group of patients who we're going to bring into the trial, and then we define what we're going to do with them, so randomize them, but we don't necessarily define what it is. And then we define how the system's going to work, who's going to be doing it, where the systems are going to be, how the recruitment will work, the consent, all of that kind of stuff. And then we define an outcome. So for COVID-19 trials, the recovery, it's a 28-day mortality. And then what happens is you put maybe 1, 2, or 3, maybe more different therapies into that trial, and you run them until you get an answer. Either you demonstrate futility or you demonstrate that it works. Now, you're right. There are many problems with that from a statistical point of view about getting type 1 errors. If you sample the data too often, you have to have independence of who's looking at the data. It can't be the researchers. But if you set this up very well for a single disease like COVID-19, that works really well, because actually a lot of the biases have been taken out. So if you take everybody who goes into hospital with COVID-19, yeah, I can work with that. And that's actually very inclusive. It's much more inclusive than most randomized controlled trials, which have massive numbers of exclusions. And so far, I think recovery trials, I think we're on sampling, I think, therapy number 10 now, monoclonal antibodies, tocilizumab, azithromycin, and one more I think we're running at the moment. That design is brilliant. And the lesson I've got for it is, or the major thing I would like to say is, we're due the next flu pandemic, folks. Just because we've had COVID 100 years after the Spanish flu doesn't mean that we have another 100 years until the next big flu. We're still due the next big flu pandemic. And what we should be doing now, everywhere, not just in the UK, but everyone should be setting up the idea of how they're going to set up a platform adaptive trial for the next flu pandemic. Because if we did that, by now, we would have had the answer. If we'd have been running in the US, UK, Italy, France, Germany, we'd have the answer for about probably 10 or 15 different therapies by now. It's got to be the future for the next pandemic, and it's got to be something we set up.
Wonderful. Thank you, Simon.